Okay. All right. Welcome to another episode of Small Talk with the Lees. So, we're going to talk about Book of Mormon today and historicity. I think like at this point, ooh, I think like at this point that we've like if you're still listening to us now and you haven't left the church, then really anything goes now. I don't know. I feel like we took care of a lot of the main issues that come up with Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and like the gold plates and stuff, but going through the route of the Book of Abraham, because really all of the questions of like, was Joseph Smith a con man, and like, why should I still read the scriptures, let's say if it's not like a literal translation, we kind of covered all these main questions. So like, I feel like this Book of Mormon episode might be a little bit of a rehash almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to start us off, I think I've been listening to this guy. His name is Greg Prince. He's an LDS historian, and author. He has an interview on Mormon Stories where he talks about maintaining your faith as a Mormon, as an intellectual. And so I think it really hits on the Book of Mormon historicity, because I guess my personal view is going to be different from Andre's maybe, and I don't know about Justin's, but I don't see a lot of good evidence for a historical model of the Book of Mormon. And what I'm going off of is, I think the strongest argument for the historicity of the Book of Mormon is going to be with the witnesses, and Justin's going to talk about that today with us. But there's also a lot of evidence on the contrary, right, with the archaeological lack of evidence, with the DNA evidence, with the anachronisms presented. So we're going to talk about Deutero-Isaiah and anachronisms as well, and all of those Book of Mormon problems that the CES letter brings up. So I think if we start off, let's start off, I'm going to play this video. Here, Greg Prince presents an argument of comparing the Book of Mormon translation with the Book of Abraham translation. So, a lot of people argue that, hey, the Book of Mormon came first, and the only reason why we care about the Book of Abraham is because I care a lot about the Book of Mormon. So a lot of people would say that the Book of Abraham doesn't discount anything about the Book of Mormon to me. I think this view presented by Greg Prince, though, has pretty good logic behind it. So I'm going to play and then we can talk about it.
So the Book of Abraham, in my view, is best described as Midrash. Midrash is the Hebrew
It's
term.
channeling something from God.
No, it isn't. It's the interplay between the scribe and the sacred text that leads to a new text. That's Midrash. The Talmud, that's what it is. The Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud.
But that's not what he told us it was.
So are you guys familiar with Midrash, first of all?
Yes. I mean, I think it's kind of like the Jewish interpretation of the scriptures, and then they'll like use the Hebrew Bible, and then they'll write and they kind of expound upon it, and that over time becomes canonized as scripture.
Yeah, they use some type of scripture, and then I think it's like the rabbis commenting on it, inspirational commentary on the Hebrew Bible, right? And then so they produce a second text. So he's comparing the Book of Abraham as a midrash. So like we have the papyri, which Joseph Smith seems as like sacred, right? We talked about that in the last episodes. And then he's writing inspired commentary on the New Testament and the Old Testament. So for the Book of Abraham, he's commenting on the Old Testament. And then with the Book of Mormon, which Greg Prince is going to talk about here in a second, he's talking about the New Testament. So I think that kind of gets into the question about, what is the first thing in the CES letter? It's like, why are there King James Version errors in the Book of Mormon? You guys remember reading that?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's like, so people are wondering why is Joseph Smith seemingly using so much 19th century material in the Book of Mormon, if the Book of Mormon's a direct translation of the plates, let's say.
Right. And I couldn't really hear the video actually. I'm not sure if the audio is coming through, so you might have to splice that in. But what was so he was talking about the interplay between like the actual text and Joseph Smith like receiving revelation and then using.
So John DeLynn here is saying, like, because normally when people talk about the catalyst theory, they make it seem very supernatural, like God is directly like still channeling
Right.
all the words you're supposed to say, and you're just the mouthpiece. You're literally just like saying what God wants you to say. But he's not saying that. He's saying that Midrash is the process of commentating on a sacred text, and with that commentary, you produce a second text. And so, like in the Jewish tradition, this is really common. They don't just lean on the text; they also lean on the spoken word of the rabbis and the teachings. It's kind of like both are king.
So what do you I remember watching that a while ago, but does he talk about what he thinks that Joseph Smith is leaning on? Is he leaning on the Bible to compose the Book of Mormon, or what does he say?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So let me keep playing the video then, and he'll explain.
It doesn't come through super clear, but yeah, just play it and then we'll add it in.
Understood. But you see, part of the essential function of a mystic is that he or she operates on a level not necessarily understanding himself or herself what's going on.
But
so it's part active, part passive, what's happening there. But if you look at the Book of Abraham.
So like we talked about this in our episode 6 and 7, the prophet puzzle and the catalyst theory. We were trying to explain what that means, because when Greg Prince says that part of the process of not knowing what's going on, so like if Joseph Smith isn't actually translating but he says he was, then like he doesn't know what's going on. We talked about how that could be possible with Ann Tave's kind of materialistic theories, like when someone says the bread of Christ is in the sacrament, you know, like do they actually believe that or not? Like do they actually know what's going on, you know? So anyway,
as the Midrash that devolves from the papyrus, that doesn't have to have any material linkage to the content of the papyrus. There's the key to the Book of Mormon. For a year, our study group in Maryland was taught once a month by a professor of Hebrew Bible from Wesley Seminary. She is Christian. She's of the United Church of Christ. But her big deal is Hebrew Bible. And she read the Book of Mormon in preparation for teaching us. And she said one day, without any disparaging content to it, because she respects the Book of Mormon as an authentic American scripture, she said, the Book of Mormon is Joseph Smith's book-length midrash on the Bible.
Right. But really, I imagine that you would worry that you would get in trouble for just really owning and admitting this. But what I hear you saying is you probably don't think that an angel delivered gold plates to Joseph.
That part is inaccessible to me, so it doesn't matter what I believe about that. There is enough of a witness that there was some kind of artifact there. Because several of the people who wrote about it say, well, the plates were covered with, but I could feel through them. There's some kind of artifact in the room. He's not looking at it. None of the accounts of the translation process have him gazing at the plates. They got him with his face in the hat and a stone in the bottom of it.
I think like 2 points that he addressed in there are super important. The first one being the testimony of the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, because I think that is one of the strongest points made in favor of Joseph Smith's reputation, let's say, or the historicity of the Book of Mormon. Because whatever you do, it's hard to get around the fact that there are these coherent witnesses that describe the dimensions and the shape and the physicality of the plates. Okay, I think the CES letter talks about spiritual eyes and stuff, but we'll get into that with Justin's presentation on this. And the second part is the stone and the rock in the hat. So like, because like, I don't know, when was the first time you guys heard about the stone in the hat? Like, how did you guys react when you learned that?
I didn't understand what they were telling me. It was a seminary teacher, I think back in 9th grade, and he was saying about how they translated the Book of Mormon. And I had always thought it was, like National Treasure, the guy gets glasses out of a brick or something and starts using it to translate directly. So for me, it was, super out there. I was like, wait a minute, he didn't really go like super into it. It was like, yeah, he had a breastplate and a top hat and, some seer stones, and that's how he translated it. And I was like, whoa, what the heck?
Yeah, I think I the first memory I recall is when I was sitting in a religion class at BYU. I think it was Dirkma, but he made a really deliberate point to emphasize repeatedly that what he's going to share, like even at the beginning of the class, it's different from what we've always heard. So like everyone is kind of prepared. Like, okay, what is he going to give it to us? Like, is he really going to pull the rug out from underneath us? So like sharing that, it was like, I was like, oh, that's odd. Like, why didn't they tell us that at first? And why are they just knowing? But I didn't really feel, I don't think I really thought about it that much. But to that point, the CES letter for the beginning of the witness chapters, it does kind of frame it in that manner, because it's saying, like, why do witnesses even matter in the first place if it wasn't a literal translation of the Book of Mormon? If they're just looking into a hat, why do you have to have a witness? I mean, he wasn't using the Book of Mormon to translate it. So I mean, that's kind of,
Yeah,
I think to that point, that's why it is actually, it could be significant for some people.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I remember I was at my last mission conference last year, and the mission president showed a slide, and it had like Joseph Smith, the picture of him touching the plates and like feeling it, and the curtain between him and the scribe. And then he's like, "Is this how we translate the Book of Mormon?" And he like chuckled, and he's like, "Nah." And then he like switched to the next slide, and then it showed like Joseph Smith with his face in the hat. And I just looked at like all of the American missionaries, I think had heard something of this matter before, but like I looked at all the native missionaries in Vietnam, and they're all just like, what? I don't know if they were like had never heard it, or if they just didn't understand what was going on because it's being translated like really slowly to them because they didn't speak English at the zone conferences. But like, so I don't know. But for me, the first time it was also in that religion class, and that was the most interesting thing for me to hear too, was the golden plates. They in the accounts, Joseph Smith is said to have had them under the bed in the room next door, right? So they're not even being used in the translation process. So I think that's like a key. I think this Midrash model fits so well in explaining that. And part of the power of this Midrash model is that so many people, when it comes to the Book of Mormon, the reason why they don't even want to go down the route and ask questions about the Book of Abraham is because they think it's black and white. It's either, because that's what Joseph Smith made it. It's like it's either a fraud or it's the greatest work on earth, right? It's either, it can't, there's no middle ground in here. And I think this Midrash theory is actually the perfect middle ground that allows you to still take into account all these data points and have a good theory on it even. But I don't know. John DeLynne's pretty critical, right? He's out here trying to.
Greg Prince seems a little bit annoyed.
Greg Princess. Well, I think John DeLynne he's probably critical, as you know, just because he feels like they keep reducing it to something else when they're like moving the goalpost constant. That's probably in his mind. That's what he's thinking.
Yeah.
But I mean, for those listening and that are kind of like irritated, like, of course it's black and white. If you're saying that it's not a fraud, I mean, if you're saying that it's not, if he's just saying that, but then like he's a fraud, I would just say, go listen to the other episodes where Brandon talks about that more. And yeah, I mean, not too much.
I mean, I think John DeLynne has the obvious questions, right? He's talking about the elephant in the room, really. And so it's interesting to see how Greg Prince defends his statements or his theory on this. So I'll keep playing it. There's a couple more minutes, just like one or two. Let's try this.
But nonetheless, there's still the linkage between an ancient artifact that he considers to be a source of canon and the process of him interacting with that, even though it's through the hat and the stone, produces the text.
But he's telling us that he got gold plates from an angel that were an ancient record of Native Americans. We know that what he produced in the Book of Mormon
Mm-hmm.
makes no scientific sense.
Yep. And he may
Which means that he likely didn't have golden plates from an angel that were an ancient record.
Well, you're connecting two dots that don't necessarily need to be connected that way.
Explain to me why.
Forget about the angel carrying gold plates to him for now, because that's inaccessible to us.
Yeah,
we have no idea.
No, you do have an idea because you're a scientist and you know that.
No, that's exactly why I don't have an idea, John, because I deal with data, and that's not a data point. We've got accounts from third parties saying there were plates in the room. So there is your ancient artifact that corresponds with the Egyptian papyrus 6 years later. You got
Not necessarily ancient. It could be something he made that year.
whatever, but there's an artifact, hymn, a new text, and that's the process. If you are able to work your way through that model, then you can look at the current Book of Mormon, and if you see the historical anachronisms, you say, yeah, what do you expect? Look at the process.
I think John Delane made a good point, though, because when he said it's not ancient, referring to the plates, right? He was basically referring to Dan Vogel's theory, which is Joseph Smith created the plates out of some other like tin or something, and then he used it to trick people. Or if Ann Taves is correct, where Joseph Smith had some type of plates or some type of box or something, and then he asked the Lord to consecrate it into the Book of Mormon, that would also constitute an artifact. A third option, I think, to throw it out there is that he actually did find some type of plates, right? Because he's out there treasure digging, he's out there looking for ancient Indian artifacts, and it's definitely possible that he came across something. I have no evidence for that, but right. I think there's multiple definitions here of what an artifact could be, right? Where I would have to agree with, let's say, John Delane and both Greg Prince as well, is that perhaps that record actually has nothing to do with Nephites and Lamanites, though. But that doesn't matter as per se with Midrash, because what he's producing the inspired text of the Book of Mormon. It doesn't matter that the artifact had or had no characters, just like we talked about in the Book of Abraham. The papyrus doesn't actually talk about Abraham at all, but that doesn't matter when it comes to producing scripture for the Book of Abraham. This is kind of like eggshells I'm walking on here right now, though.
Yeah, but I think it is important to kind of explore that, and like for someone more of like the John Delane, persuasion, they're going to want to come down on that. Joseph Smith fabricated it and we're just kind of using it to persuade people. For someone that wants to remain faithful and hold to that paradigm, which is nothing wrong with that either, I think they're going to want to hold to it that, based on this model, that it was something that he dug up, that he found, and it was maybe an ancient artifact, and that was kind of what inspired this midrash, this process of him receiving the channel to compose these things.
Yeah. And I don't like to comment too much about this issue because the Book of Mormon is like the most sacred text to us as Latter-day Saints, right? And so talking anything about Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon really, really upsets people, and people don't feel comfortable hearing this stuff. So that's why I don't even feel like this is a necessary topic because of what we've addressed in the Book of Abraham. I feel like you still have to deal with all the same questions of Joseph Smith as a translator, of the literalness of the text. Like, does it matter if there's like any connection between the text and the scriptures, right? I think we kind of even covered that with the papyri not having any correlation with the Book of Abraham.
Yeah, true.
So the thing I like about the Midrash theory, though, is it's as naturalistic as you want it to be, in that it could just be Joseph Smith's pure creativity, or it could be him receiving revelations. So like the definition of inspiration that I kind of like is the combination of human creativity in response to the divine persuasion, right? And so if you're going to lean on John Delane's side, you're going to say, hey, this is entirely just human creativity. And then if you're going to be, let's say, a faithful member, I don't know, I'm not here to define what faithful is or not. But let's say if you want to be on the more positive side, then you would say this is going to lean on the from God side, that this text is coming from God, right? And I think the Midrash theory is is expansive enough that you can hold this view as an intellectual like Greg Prince and still deal with the data points, like you said. And then one of those data points that's really strong is the 8 and 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, right? It's not as strong as maybe we grew up learning in Sunday school, but
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, you don't need to raise your hand. Feel free to jump in whenever.
So I have an argument with this because if you do believe in the Midrash theory, then what would be your evidence, or what would be like your way to convince me that why didn't he do it again? Why didn't he have another?
Why didn't he need any artifact for the Book of Moses? Because he didn't have an artifact for the Book of Moses, right?
And well, okay, so let's see, Book of Mormon. Then he was doing
Book of Mormon.
translations. He was doing the
the King James version of the
King
Bible.
James.
He was doing the inspired translation or commentary on it, which is
Also,
Midrash.
Why
That's literally Midrash.
Why do Midrash so quickly on the Book of Mormon? That's kind of an interesting.
What do you mean by quickly?
Like the process took very fast?
Yeah, the process was fast.
So that's what the CES did. The CES letter talk about like the time frame, because I think the argument is typically like he had from 1923 to 1927. He was trying to get the plates, but he couldn't, and so people kind of view this as like he's pondering and thinking about the Bible during this time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not all just like, even if he's dictating extemporaneously, like without preparation in advance, he is. So like to explain this view, kind of Michael Coe. I was listening to the episode of Michael Coe in preparation for this on archaeology. He's a non-LDS archaeologist that comments on Book of Mormon archaeology, and he talked about how Joseph Smith, he called him the greatest man, not just the greatest American, one of the greatest Americans to ever live, but one of the greatest men to ever live. And he talked about what we do see from the Book of Mormon is how well Joseph Smith knew the Bible and the Old Testament. He had that thing down on the back of his hand. So I don't see as far as like kind of the Tadar Callister argument, like, oh, how could a human create such a beautiful text? I don't really see. I guess that doesn't make as much sense to me if it's someone who cares deeply about the Bible and has been pondering it ever since he was like 12 or 14 years old.
Mm. Yeah, but so it's interesting that he did the Midrash on the Book of Mormon and then did the Midrash on the Bible. Why wouldn't he do it vice versa?
So the Midrash on the Book of Mormon is not a Midrash on the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is a Midrash
the Book of Mormon is
on the New
Midrash
Testament.
on the Bible.
Yeah, and then he went straight after the Book of Mormon. He went to the Old Testament in Genesis. That's how he started producing
the Book of Mormon.
Moses text.
It doesn't go to New Testament times until Helaman or something, right?
Right. I guess there's a little bit of Old Testament in there because he's connecting it back to his reign of Zedekiah and the gathering and scattering of the Jews. So he's definitely reading a lot of Isaiah.
So, and it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's just a lot to keep track of, like keeping track of the law of Moses and like their customs and things like that. Very, very difficult. I think to the Midrash theory, there is this sort of like reductionist view that I don't necessarily like agree with.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was it John Dehlin?
Yeah, the interviewer.
His name? John Dehlin. He makes a really good point, and he's pressing him, and I think it is shaky, like you were saying, like you're standing on like eggshells because
I meant eggshells as in this is a touchy subject for any believer and anyone who holds
is that what
the
you
Book
meant?
of Mormon
Okay,
close to
sorry.
your heart. Yeah, not so much the theory. I think the theory is I do have to admit this point. Like, I don't think we came up with this theory just because it seemed like the most plausible one since 2 centuries ago. I think it has been a shifting of the goalposts almost. So I would admit that. But I do think it is a strong theory in that it takes into account all the data points we have, like the witnesses to a physicality of the plates. It takes into account that Joseph Smith wasn't using the plates, and it takes into account that there's all this 19th century language of the of the 1827 or something King James version of the Bible in the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
that's
So I
interesting.
think it's just to that, like Brandon, I think is like taking into account all those previous discussions that we've had around the CES letter. The Midrash theory does, I guess, provide more of a stability if you're going to accept.
Right. So like when it comes to the Book of Abraham, Andre, like would you say the Midrash is the best explanation for Book of Abraham?
The Book of Abraham. I would say the Book of Abraham is more likely to be Midrash than the Book of Mormon.
Okay. So I mean that's where people can openly disagree, right? Because I think a lot of people listening to this are going to say the Book of Abraham's Midrash, but the Book of Abraham's Midrash, but the Book of Mormon to me is still a literal history, right? Like the Nephites and Lamanites were actual people. Christ came to the Western Hemisphere. And I think if you want to believe that, that is like more power to you, right? And that's the core of the members of the church are going to think this way as well. But for me, it just seems like the Midrash theory of the Book of Abraham tells us everything about the Book of Mormon, in that it shouldn't be a disconnect as to why Joseph Smith produced one book this way, but then the other book was totally different.
Right.
So Andre, I'm just curious, does it seem problematic for someone to, I guess, reduce the Book of Mormon? Like, does it sound like when you're saying that you're kind of disregarding the importance of the Book of Mormon?
Well, yeah, it does seem problematic. So Brandon and I were just at
let's flesh that out.
We were just at the academic dialogue with Judaism and Latter-day Saints, and it was super good, and we had a good time. And Brandon asked a pretty solid question.
I learned Midrash is pronounced Midrash. I was like,
yeah, no, it was super cool.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but one of the things that they talk about is that rabbis oftentimes disagree, right? And so this opens up the argument of remember church history and Joseph Smith history, where I can't remember who it was, but he also claimed that he had a stone and could interpret and things like that. And so it opens up the floodgates.
Hiram, I think, or
I can't remember who it was.
ENC 9 or something, where he rebukes.
But it opens up this possibility of priesthood keys being used for sort of like this midrash or like this op-ed piece on scripture. And so it there's the possibility of having like arguments. So for example, I could argue with if one rabbi argues with another rabbi, then we could also have similar things happening in our culture, and it would take away from that like conduit system that we have.
It takes away from the authority, right? The sense of authority.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean that's so when it comes to
wait, when you say it takes away the sense of authority from like the church leaders.
So like no, that's not what I mean.
From Revelation.
So
okay.
Yeah, because the whole issue is pseudepigrapha, right? Which, by the way, not only Mormons have to deal with, Christians, evangelicals, Jewish people, they all have to deal with the problem of pseudepigrapha. That is, scriptural texts in our holy canon were not actually written by the people that their names are on it. That's not the authors. But the whole point of saying like, hey, this like Nephi wrote this, or John the Revelator wrote the book of John, right? The point of saying that is to have an authoritative view on it, and it lets you present heretical ideas, which is what Joseph Smith was doing in the 19th century, was presenting heretical but early Christian ideas, and it gives it power behind it almost. And so if we start to be picking at the historicity, let's say, then it almost seems like it loses that power in a way. But I would push back against that by saying, hey, look, the only reason why we see it as losing this kind of authority is because we grew up looking at it in this lens. Because if I told you, hey, Jesus's parable on the 10 virgins isn't a real story about 10 virgins, you wouldn't say like, oh man, now it's lost all of its credibility, right? And you wouldn't be able to say like, hey, now I can't learn anything from this anymore. I feel like that's just a total inaccurate representation of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Not your view. I mean, I think that people commentating say, hey, I can't find any more value in the Book of Mormon if I were to take this, let's say, this alternative view on the historicity of it. I think that's just bogus.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
can see that.
I think it's like, I mean, I don't feel like myself personally, I don't feel like I have a conclusive point where I'm saying, okay, I think that the Midrash, I feel like I haven't completely made my mind up on this, but it seems like there's like two sides to the coin. It's just where on one end, people are overly concerned that if you reduce it so it's not historical anymore and literal, then it's bad, because once we start talking about the meaning, then we're kind of untethering it so you can kind of go anywhere you want. And then on the other end, people are scared about us saying, oh, it's all just about meaning. Then because it's all just about meaning, that means it's completely worthless. They're just making all this crap up anyways. So, but I think people are kind of, they would like to box this conversation into one of those two camps, but I don't think that's what we're doing.
What about the one-liners, Brandon? I want to get your take on that. Like, you have all these one-liners in the Book of Mormon, and so I think when it comes to the Midrash, you know, part of the argument that we have church leaders talking about, like we were talking about earlier with Tad Arcalister, is that they claim that the Book of Mormon is divine, and it's more obviously towards like the catalyst theory than the Midrash theory. But so part of this is
the Midrash is the catalyst theory is a superset of the Midrash. Like Midrash just belongs under catalyst theory.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
So where does divinity fit into Midrash, I guess, is my question.
Right. So that's what I was saying about how Midrash is an inspired commentary on a sacred text. And so when it comes to inspired, it just matters to your definition, right? If you're going to view Joseph Smith and the restoration in a favorable light, you're going to view it more as, yes, there was no actual, let's say, he had plates maybe, let's even give him the golden plates, but it's not actually talking about an ancient civilization and the things we read in the Book of Mormon, let's say. But God, and here's the channeling, I guess, that John DeLynne's talking about. God channeled down this information to Joseph Smith. See, I don't tend to view it specifically in that manner because of, I think there's this verse in the Book of Mormon where Nephi's writing and he says, hey, like, I've written a separate record on the history of my people, but that's not what matters for the latter days or whatever. Like, what matters are the other stuff, right? And that's almost like the part about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon is to present higher truths, is to present religious truths to us rather than the actual historical setting.
Let me ask you another question then. Okay, so when Joseph Smith loses the 116 pages, he's like, well, I guess we could just like retranslate them. How does the Midrash kind of get into this?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know how to deal with that data point yet, because I know that's a point of contention. People usually use that as saying like, hey, he's making it up, right? That means because he couldn't produce it again. I haven't really studied out the issue how you'd art like the favorable side of using that. I don't know.
Justin, what do you think? Any question? Any like comments on that?
So you're saying like when the Book of Lehi, when he lost that?
Yeah.
Right.
And then
yeah,
how would the Midrash?
That's a good objection.
I don't know. I really don't, because I think on one end you just say that he was kind of trying to further create this conspiracy to deceive people. If I was to be very negative about it, right? But I don't.
I think there's a positive case to be made here. I know Don Bradley has written a whole book, just barely, on the lost 160 page. Don Bradley's the guy that spoke at the Sunstone with the 4 prophet puzzle guys. So I think I would have to read that before I could even comment on that. But I mean, that's a good objection, usually made in favor of the Joseph Smith is making it up theory, of course. But Don Bradley's a faithful farm scholar, actually, talking about the 160 pages.
Okay. Yeah. When it comes to inspiration, I think it's very interesting because I do think that there are inspired texts. I even think that some political speeches are inspired, in the way that they're worded and things like that. And I think, Brandon, you and I were talking about it's interesting, like the phenomenology of like how you can read one thing with the perception of what it means, and then by adding like another sentence, you change that perception, and you almost get like this inspirational feel to it, trying to think like of an example, like for example, when I think it's Mark Saban, when he asked his dad in a talk, he says, my dad's 90 years old. I was pushing him in a wheelchair, and he said, Dad, can I offer you a wheelchair? His dad was walking. He's like, Dad, can I offer you a wheelchair? And his dad goes, no, son. When I get tired of walking, I'll just run. And so your first interpretation is like, when I get tired of walking, you would obviously sit down, right? But then you see the second line and it says, I'll just run. And even though that's something that's obviously like very, improbable, is that a 90-year-old man's just going to run. But because it changes the dynamic of the first sentence, it has this almost like inspirational feeling towards it,
So I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but I've been looking. So there's a blog, it's by Progmos, but by common consent. And there's this one thread where someone's reading the Book of Mormon, but from let's say a less literal view. And they go through like section by section of the Book of Mormon. And just exploring it in this way, it starts to open up new avenues. Like when you stop thinking of Nephi as like, hey, like this guy's the perfect righteous prophet and everything he says goes, and then you start realizing, hey, this guy's pretty stuck up. There's a reason why their family's so messed up, because they don't know how to communicate properly with each other. And then not only that, it makes them more human.
He's an anti-Nephi Lehi.
Yeah. I'm pro layman. I don't know, but like it actually turns these people more human, because instead of being these infallible prophets, suddenly it becomes the guy that next door that always plays the like prophet card. He's like, hey, I have the priesthood, you should marry me type thing. That's almost what it seems like. So I feel like there's just so many more lessons you can actually draw from this inspired text of the Book of Mormon, which is deeply sacred to me and so many others, right? But you have to it actually opens your mind if you start thinking about it in a less historical way. That doesn't mean you have to give up the historical perspective, but if you think of it from that way,
But so I think that would even be more historical, right? Because you do know that people are infallible. And so if you are to make it a fiction, then you can say Nephi is infallible. But because it is, if you look at it,
that's what it seems like, right?
Yeah,
Nephi seems infallible.
He seems infallible. But yeah, if you think, based off your own life and kind of things that you've lived and experienced, you say, well, a man can't be infallible, right? So I think that actually proves against what you're saying. I think that if you add that part in, then you're almost being more historical. Just like how we use.
But I think, restricted to the text of the Book of Mormon. I mean, I think typically members that read it have a very favorable view. Like a literal interpretation, like a historical interpretation of the Book of Mormon, you just see Nephi as this person that's recording it, right? Because we're thinking, okay, this is a literal record. Nephi's a historian. He seems like this great guy through that lens, right? But if you're opening it up and saying, look, we don't have to take his literal interpretation. You start to see why maybe more progmos.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not saying there's problems. There's all sorts of problems, right? The first one would be Jesus. Did he actually?
Oh, I'm not saying there's problems. I'm just saying. I was just saying, like to Andre's point. I think it's different to say like, oh yeah, it makes it seem more genuine, and saying it's historical. Just because it seems more genuine doesn't make it more historical.
Yeah. What I meant was,
are you sure? Are you sure? Because if I'm being accurate to my life, it would be writing my faults as well, right?
So, right, but Nephi does not. Really
as far as an actual historical event happening. Well, I think a good way to compare this is if we had been grown up learning that the 10 virgins had to actually, like, we learned their names. Like this virgin was named Josiah, and this one was, all these. Like if we learned it in a very literal way, suddenly learning like, hey, this is just a parable, but it's not just a parable. That word "just" is like. Man, when people use the word inspired fiction, nobody actually calls it this. Like, I don't agree with that view because that's not what it is. I think there's a lack of realizing that when you can start comparing the Book of Mormon stories to your actual personal life, like that has nothing to do with the historicity of it, but it has extreme value in that if you can actually start implementing it. And what is that verse in the Book of Mormon where it's like, liken these things to yourself? Right? Really, if you think of religion like I do from the perspective, hey, religion is here to transform you, to help you become a new person, a new creature, right? Then this doesn't take any of that value away from the scriptures. In fact, I'm trying to argue here that it actually adds more value. And the problem why we can't see this is we've come to this question from reading the CES letter. So of course it's going to seem like John DeLyn's view is correct in that all of this just seems like goalposts moving. But if you had actually ever studied someone like, let's say, Jordan Peterson and his reading on the Hebrew Bible, like you'll start to realize what I mean by, hey, there's actual fundamental value in these scriptural texts that we don't understand because we're not actually thinking of it in this perspective. So I don't believe that actually most people listening to this podcast right now will actually truly understand what I'm saying. They're probably going to think we're saying, hey, this is just inspired fiction, or they're going to say, hey, it's all just a bunch of bogus, right? And I totally disagree with both of those viewpoints.
So, okay, so I guess what I'm understanding from you saying, Brandon, is like there are some fiction stories that you can take, you can go dive deep into them, like how Jordan Peterson does with like Pinocchio, and like, you know, he does it with the which one's this one? The Princess
Lion
and the Frog.
King. Right. So in the CES letter, when it says like, hey, like if I feel the spirit while watching the Lion King, does that mean that really happened? And so like when we say Jordan Peterson analyzed these stories, it actually sounds really off-putting. It's like, yeah, he analyzed Pinocchio, like, but like, hey, you got to listen to the actual Pinocchio bit. He spends 3 hours on it. You know, it's more profound than you think.
So I guess my question is this a new story, right? A lot of times we just repeat the same story, but the Book of Mormon has a lot of new stories in it that I think, and the reason that I say new is because there's a lot of pieces that fit together. And so is that kind of what moves you to say that this is inspired, that this has more to it? Is it because it's something that's not necessarily found in our pop culture? Usually we have like the hero archetype, right? But it's not, the Book of Mormon isn't really like a hero archetype. It's like what would you say? There are archetypes in there, but I don't know. Is that why you think that it's inspired? Because they have,
you know, that's a good question, and it really requires like a very scientific analysis.
Take
almost
a lot longer too.
Yeah, I think I don't really have a clear answer at the moment. I'm gonna quote Greg Prince here, the guy that we're just watching. So when it comes to Book of Mormon historicity, he likes to turn the question on people, and he says, hey, like people that so if you ask someone who's read the Book of Mormon, you can ask them 3 questions, right? It's something like how much
remember?
What do you remember? Or how much did you read? What do you remember? Do you remember the other question?
And why do you like?
And how do you feel about that? Okay.
Yeah.
What did you read? How do you what do you remember? And how do you feel about it? Something like that. And then normally you can always hear the same answer to the first 2 questions of the Book of Mormon. Because I'm not going to say the Book of Mormon isn't boring. Like I'm sure tons of people read it and think, hey, this is boring, right? The first answer is like, hey, I read some of it. I probably didn't finish it cover to cover. It was just too long. The second answer is, what do I remember? There was a bunch of wars and stuff.
War stories.
You know, but then when you ask them the third question, they can give an entire sermon on that. You know, what did the Book of Mormon make you feel? And there's something mysterious about it in that sense, in that it's the tool, right? It's the symbol that Joseph Smith's goal was to touch the face of God. He's like the modern Icarus. He's trying to reach heaven and bring it down to his people. And he had the vision to give his first gift to his people was the symbol of the Book of Mormon. And that Book of Mormon, it doesn't even matter, like Joseph Smith, maybe he wasn't translating directly from the plates, but even when we read the Book of Mormon, half of the time we're not actually reading the Book of Mormon. We're reading ourselves into the Book of Mormon. And there must be some type of archetypal nature or something like you're trying to flesh out in the Book of Mormon that allows for that divine connection. Because even, you know, the majority of members have felt some type of spiritual witness, let's call it, or some type of feeling that connected them to something divine, or something that they interpreted as divine even.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are, while you're saying that, I'm thinking of stories in the Book of Mormon. Recently I read Alma 36, where it talks about how Alma kind of like reads he goes into that like coma or passes out or whatever for 3 days, and he comes out of it like feeling that he's no longer tormented by it. And so I think that when I read that, I really thought of myself, and I was really, really trying to connect there. And I remember times before where I've read like Alma 32, and I've thought, I felt, my testimony this way, that my testimony I do feel is like my testimony of God and a greater creation of this universe is like a tree and sprouting. And it's not something that was ever like cut down. Like people say, like I found a testimony, but I don't think I ever found one. I just think it like grew. And so I really connected with that. And then there are multiple times in the Book of Mormon where I read about people that are contentious, right? The Antichrist coming, Korihor or in some parts
It's Jordan Peterson.
Aram and stuff like that. And so it helps me to understand how to deal with my own problems of anti-faith or of anti-God and things like that. And it really uses this kind of, I would think, this, well, it's I can't just simplify it. That's that, but it does use like this utilitarian. No, is it more?
It's a pragmatic.
Is pragmatic. So you stay true to the right thing, because God will help you if you do that. And so it's this like, I wouldn't even say, it's not utilitarian. It's not even Kantian, because Kantian says like doesn't matter what the consequences are, like you just do the right thing. But there's really like this like ultimate glory principle behind an action. And so I think that that's interesting as well. And you don't find it in a lot of stories necessarily. It's usually more like good follows good, bad follows bad.
I think, Andre, I think that's like that's what makes for good stories, if it can really apply like to people at large, right? If you're just saying, oh, the Book of Mormon taught me today that I shouldn't tie my left shoe, I should just, like, that means nothing to anyone. That subjective experience doesn't matter, right? So what you try to do is, when you say that, you try to abstract it, make it more generalized, and say the Book of Mormon really inspires me to focus on what's right. Like, that's something that anyone can apply into their lives. And I think kind of and that we'll have to get into this in later episodes, is that the Book of Mormon is helping us experience God, helping us experience the gospel more. And whether or not it's that literal or historical, which I think it is fascinating to dig into and talk about, what matters more is kind of that experience that it mediates with you, with God. How is it going to get you closer?
I really like that. Helps us experience God. I really like that.
So, yeah, I think this topic was. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Nope, keep going. I think we got off track a little bit.
Yeah,
so
I think the topic was worthwhile, just because probably this is actually what more people care about hearing, is our perspective even on the Book of Mormon. And I think it kind of, remember how we talked about in the second episode, where we're introducing our testimonies, even it's like, we have on this, or the first episode actually, we have this discussion on the church history and all the problems of translation. But then at the surface, or like underneath all of that, is this more important discussion about like, how is this actually interacting with your life, let's say, and what does this have to actually do with real life instead of this abstract world. So it's good to kind of show that there's more to this discussion than just these very particular topics, because we kind of sometimes forget that when we zoom in really close. But I think
that's what we're kind of doing, is we want to zoom in, and then obviously I think we will want to zoom back out later on, and we can talk more about
and I mean, sometimes I zoom in so close that like you just watch the Book of Abraham episode, you're like, hey, these guys are criticizing, like these guys can't be Mormons, even probably, like you see the comments on those threads. But like, and then you zoom back out and then you zoom into a different video, you're like, oh, these guys are like just normal Mormons. Is like, so like there's the way this podcast is set up is you have to kind of listen to all of it if you want to get these ideas and actually kind of see the big picture here. So what we're going to do now is we're going to zoom right back in to why we might have this debate, because there's no point in talking about the Book of Mormon may or may not be historical if there's no problems with it. So we're going to cover those problems that the CES letter talks about. Namely, we're going to go through the witnesses. We're going to go through Deutero-Isaiah and anachronisms, which the CES letter actually took out anachronisms in their newest version. I think because they thought it wasn't a good enough argument. And then also archaeology and DNA studies, which isn't in the CES letter, but is important to the discussion as well.
Oh, sorry. I have another question for you, Brandon, before we jump
Okay.
in. Remind me, what is it called? Midrash? Midrash. So can you, in this Midrash theory, can you, like, an idea doesn't come from nowhere, but in Midrash, can an idea come from nowhere? Like, yeah.
That's if it's being channeled down, then technically yes. But I think as we study the revelations of Joseph Smith, we mentioned the D&C 29 being like Joseph Smith writing down very disjoint ideas, and then the Book of Moses as a midrash, except there's no artifact, so it's technically maybe not a midrash. But he, and then it goes into this coherent narrative in the Book of Moses. So like we never see Joseph Smith actually acting in a vacuum when he's producing revelation. So I don't think personally, I don't think it works that way as a vacuum.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, that's a very complicated topic too. Like, do thoughts just come from nowhere? Like, do you really own your thoughts, or like? Well, I mean, a lot of these things are kind of digging into consciousness, and
the big arguments are like his river of water that's in Nephi, his that ABC CBA type.
Yeah. What is that called again?
The chiasmus.
The chiasmus, and these like Jewish traditions and things like that. And so I don't know. So is the Midrash arguing that they come from a vacuum, or they don't? What's your
I think it's mostly arguing that it doesn't come from because if it's Midrash is an inspired commentary, right? So we talked about the mix of creativity with the mix of the divine persuasion. My view is that the divine persuasion is there, but it's so little, it's just enough to get you started almost. It's like Joseph Smith had a vision, right? He saw something, and that was enough to get him started. And then after that, he's reading up on he's going to different sermons, he's reading up on the Bible, he's reading commentaries on the Bible, right? We know he had Adam Clarke's Bible commentary. He has all these sources. He's associating himself with people like Sidney Rigdon, these other people who are very educated and know a lot about religious topics. Okay, so when we say that Joseph Smith wasn't educated,
but
he was definitely educated to religious topics.
Just for the viewers, Sidney Rigdon was converted to the church by the Book of Mormon. I just wanted to make that pretext there.
Okay, sorry, I might have my time frames wrong. Yeah, I also don't confess to being an expert in any of this history stuff. But yeah, like he's surrounding himself with religious people with interesting religious ideas, right? And so just add this up for like 7 years, let's say from 1823 up to the time 1827, I think he starts with the book, and it's published around 1829 or so. I think, but anyways, these ideas are being fleshed out in his mind, and it's the same thing in D&C 9, I think, when he's talking about, hey, you have to think these things through your mind and think them out. God isn't going to just give them to you almost. So I don't think he's ever even arguing that he's just channeling
in a vacuum.
This
interesting
stuff.
I like that. Yeah, it's interesting.
But good question. I think that plays in nicely with the loose translation, the tight translation. We kind of raised that like, hey, Joseph Smith translated like in the Stone in the Hat. It's like he sees a character, he writes it down almost. But I don't think that's the case.
Is there any evidence to suggest? Is there people writing? Was there any journals or anything like that to suggest that he was seeing characters in the hat?
I think there's a quote on that. Yeah, I think that is an actual source. I think when it comes to these quotes, though, it's highly. I think so. I actually learned that quote in the Foundation of Restoration class at BYU, and I think Dirk Matt, the professor, said like, hey, like, how does the scribe who's saying this, like, how does he know what, or I guess the person in the room, I don't think it was the scribe, but like, how does he know what Joseph Smith is actually doing? So he kind of discounted that quote when he,
like a speculation or something like
that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's hard to say with all these quotes because there's so many conflicting quotes, but I don't think Yeah, I think the Book of Mormon would just be so much more choppy if it was coming out that way. And we see like from his Book of Moses and Book of Abraham translations that we talked about, it's not a like one-to-one. Like that's where you get the really bad Egyptian alphabet and grammar, right? When he's trying to actually do that.
Yeah.
And we would, yeah, like you read the Book of Mormon, it flows very well. He's doing extemporaneously, which means he's dictating, he's spilling it out.